Good afternoon, everyone. We will now call the Senate Judiciary Committee to order. Our first order of business is a hearing on SB 286 regarding COVID-19 claims. So we have an amendment to SB 286 that I'd like to pass out and share, and then we will ask the reviser, Mr. Thompson, to explain the amendment. While we're passing out that amendment, as you all know, the pandemic, as it came to Kansas, started with the emergency declaration by the governor March 12th, 2020. And since that time, we've all lived through a lot, and we've all been affected in different ways, but many times in the same way. What Senate Bill 286 is looking at some monetary relief for businesses who suffered some financial loss because of orders that were put into place through no fault of that business's conduct. And we've been asked by many Kansans to take a look at that. So that's what the amendment proposes to do. And with that, we then will hear from the reviser about what the amendment does, and then we'll open it up for some testimony. So with that, Mr. Reviser, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, Committee. Jason Thompson with the Reviser's Office. I distributed the electronic version of this to the committee secretary, so anyone wishing to obtain that can contact Iris or you can contact our office and we'll make sure you get that. I've also shared my screen, so hopefully you can see it if you're following online. As the chairperson said, this is a bill that would enact the COVID-19 Business Relief Act. It does have some appropriations provisions and some funding provisions, and I'll try not to get too detailed on any part. I'll just kind of stick to an overview at this point and see what questions you might have. The first section here is a name for the act and also reminds us that this will expire when the federal funds go away. So it will only be in existence for a few years here. The definitions, there's a board that is created by Section 3 that we'll talk about in just a moment. Business is a key definition. So you have to be an entity that has 50 or less, had 50 or less full-time equivalent employees during a defined period. There's still a little bit of discussion about what that period should be, but we're talking about businesses with 50 or less FTEs, so small businesses. And you had to have been organized under our state law or doing business in our state on March 12th of 2020 when the emergency declaration began. So those are your qualifiers as a business. It does not include a not-for-profit or not-for-profit corporation or business entity. Governmental entity, in this case, means the state and its departments and instrumentalities, and any county or city and its instrumentalities. Those are also the people that are required to establish a fund if they made a certain order, which is the next term defined here. So if you made an order related to the COVID-19 pandemic and it imposed a restriction, which is another definition here, then you are required to set aside some funding from federal funds to compensate businesses or to provide relief to businesses in the terms of the bill. I do note, if you remember our prior discussion in March about this topic, the language discussed at that time that the cities had asked for regarding mask requirements, that kicks in commencing May 31st of this year. If you mandate face masks, that is when you become a restriction that is subject to a claim. And that's one of the things that was discussed last time. It is in this bill, so I wanted to point it out before we moved on. New Section 2 is a state fund, the COVID-19 Business Relief Fund, that would be administered by the Attorney General. So beginning January 1 of 2023, we could use these monies for other purposes, but until that time, this money can only be used to pay the claims as provided in Section 4, to pay some other compromises or settlements or judgments potentially, to pay the expenses and compensation for the board that's about to be discussed, and to pay the costs of the board and the Office of the Attorney General related to this act. I'll skip down from there. There's a lot of appropriations language in here discussing how, if you've already allocated certain federal funds, those should be taken from the pot first, and then the Director of Accounts and Reports sort of certifies the remainder and places a percentage of those funds aside. And so it's 25%. I know we had a discussion last time. So following all these transfers, the Director of the Budget determines 25% of the remaining monies and transfers those into this special account that will then be administered by the AG and the board that we're about to talk about in new Section 3. The COVID-19 Business Relief Claims Board. It will be 3 members, 1 appointed by the governor, 1 appointed by the president of the Senate, and 1 appointed by the Speaker of the House. These all have to be made on or before July 1st of this year. The members of the board have to be residents of Kansas. They have to have some training or experience for the duties imposed by this act. They have to be individuals who are recognized for outstanding knowledge and leadership in the fields of finance or business. And at least one of them has to be an attorney that is admitted to practice law in Kansas. The board gets to choose their chairperson from among its 3 members. It meets on call of the chair. Quorum is 2 members. Actions must be taken by a majority of the members of the board. They do get paid compensation and allowances and mileage, the same as members of the legislature. So there is a little bit of money provided to these folks for their service. The board has authority to hire expert consultants to help them do the duties imposed by this act. And then on or before November 1st of this year, the board would have to have its policies and procedures adopted so that we know how the claims process would work. And if they find they need rules and regulations, they are given that option as well. New Section 4 then provides the claims process that I just mentioned. This act is administered by the board with the assistance and support of the Attorney General's office. All claims would come from businesses to this board in a form and manner approved by the board. And you'll note here on page 6, the first major sort of time provision, beginning on January 1 of 2022 and ending on March 31 of 2022. That will be the claim window provided for businesses to file their claim with the board. Then there's a list of items the business must provide. Proof that they're a business as defined in Section 1, for example, copies of tax returns, and then an affidavit. The affidavit has to state several things involving how they were affected by a governmental entity that issued an order that made a restriction, the number of days they may have been closed, a description of the financial impact on their business, whether they were essential or non-essential under the Kansas Essential Functions Framework, and any other sort of COVID-19 funds they may have received from governmental grants or loans that didn't have to be repaid, that sort of thing. And then the board can also ask for additional information in order to find out whether relief should be granted, and if so, how much. All that information is confidential. It's not an open record, so that's noted there. And then the board has requirements for deciding the claims provided in this section, but they are not required to have hearings. They decide based on the information presented to them, and any of their meetings in deciding claims are not subject to the Administrative Procedures Act or the Open Meetings Act. So when they're deciding a claim, that is a closed meeting. It is not an administrative hearing. It is a special kind of hearing or meeting that they're having, and not an open meeting. I would note that does not include, for example, meetings where they're adopting policies or adopting rules and regulations or discussing those. That's not deciding a claim. So those could be open meetings, but anything about a claim would not be an open meeting. Here's the list on page 8 of the items the board has to evaluate. Basically, a lot of the things that the business will submit to them, the board's then required to evaluate. The costs that they may have incurred and the relief that they may be entitled to. They also factor in the money available to provide that relief. And so the board is then required to sort of balance the money available with the claims being made. Then on page 9, you see that on or before December 30th of 2022, the board has to decide all of the claims that were filed. So we had an opening window at the beginning of 2022, and the window closes for the board to make all of its decisions at the end of 2022. They have to issue written decisions. It has to specify certain information provided here on page 9. And then we have a couple special provisions that we also discussed in previous hearings or discussions about how if a county and a state and the state have an applicable order that is the same, the policy decision made here is that the board can assign up to 50% of the relief to be paid to the county and the other 50% to the state. They can balance that depending on availability of funds and give some of that relief responsibility to the county, even if the order is just the same as the state's order. If the state order is more restrictive, obviously the money would come from the state. If the county order was more restrictive, the money would come from the county. Similarly, but a little different, a city is not going to be assigned any portion of the relief if they were the same or less restrictive. So the only relief provided from city funds is if they were more restrictive. So there's a little difference between the state, the county, and the city. And again, that's a policy choice, but that's been discussed a little bit previously. The written decisions go to the Attorney General. And within 30 days, the Attorney General then authorizes payment from the state fund in Section 2 and notifies any county or city about a fund in 5 or 6 that they have to pay from. The Attorney General can also say that there are no monies left and certify that, which would make any claims against those funds null and void. So if the money's gone, the money's gone. The big thing here on page 10 is if you file a claim under this act with the board, you're then prohibited from filing any claim against the state for any claims based on an order making a restriction related to the COVID-19 pandemic. So, for example, you would not be able to file a claim under KEMA, under 48-933, or under any of the other options that you might have. So you're electing this remedy versus the other remedy. Again, policy choice, and something that's been discussed previously. And finally, there's a section here just saying this does not create a property right or a right of action. There's no appeal. There's no administrative hearing process. This is an entirely separate remedy that you can elect or not elect. And if you do elect it, it has an impact on your other claims. And I won't dig into Section 5 and 6 other than to say Section 5 requires counties who have issued orders that make restrictions under this act to set aside some funds. If they didn't issue an order that made a restriction, they don't have to set aside funds. Same for Section 6 for cities. If they made a restriction through an order, they have to set aside funds, and if they didn't, they don't. If they create a fund, they have to notify the Attorney General, who can relay that to the board so they can consider that in their discussion about relief. And then if they're notified that they have to pay, either a county or a city, by the Attorney General, at the end of the process, there's a provision that says they have to pay from their fund, just to make that clear. And with that, I'll see if you have any questions.
Mr. Thompson, wanted to make the committee aware and those following along listening online that we are honored to have with us in our committee meeting room today Mr. Attorney General Derek Schmidt, who has offered to kind of answer any sort of overall general questions and speak to what we're looking at in this amendment. And Mr. General, would you like to wait until we ask the revisor questions, or the podium is yours if you would like it now?
Well, Madam Chair, thank you. And I don't have prepared remarks. I'll be around today to answer any questions you may have. I just appreciate the legislature's continued attention to this. As I think you all know, our interest is that big picture, it seems to us, either you all are going to decide as a matter of policy how to deal with this, or we are ultimately going to decide, or the courts are, case by case through litigation. There are already some filed, and it just has always seemed to me better if you all can decide. So I really appreciate all the work that's gone into building whatever consensus there is around this, and we're glad to help however we can.
All right, then. Thank you, Mr. General. And then if you're around for questions as we work through this today, you will let us know that you are. Great. So committee, any questions for the revisor Or, yes, Senator Gossage.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Could I please have a clarification on that 25%? I know we talked about this before, but 25% of what, and what happens to the other 75%?
Mr. Revisor, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Jason Thompson here. So it's the provision is on page 3 and then onto page 4, and it's very similar to what you saw the last time. So hopefully this is a little bit of a refresher and not something entirely new. And I'll caveat this with I'm not an appropriations revisor, so this is my best understanding of it. There are monies identified from the federal government for aid to the state for coronavirus relief, as appropriated by the acts listed there on page 4. So there's several of them: the CARES Act, the Family First Coronavirus Response Act, etc. So there's a pool of federal money that's to be looked at, and of those monies, there are certain transfers already required by other law, and that's listed on page 4. For example, there's a Senate sub for House Bill 2196 and Senate sub for House Bill 2208 that both allocated some federal money to another purpose. So that is a policy choice, but at this point, the legislature has said they want the money to go to those issues. And so it's written in such a way that those transfers happen first. And then of the remaining federal monies that we've identified, the director of the budget determines 25% of that and transfers it to this fund. So I don't know exactly what that amount will be. I think our fiscal folks in the research department might have an idea of what that might be, but that's how it's supposed to work. There's a federal pot of money that's been identified. There are some things that have to come out first, and then this would come out next. And so that's kind of how the allocation was decided.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And a follow-up question. So we're talking about this going to the counties. Have we talked about how that's going to be appropriated to each county?
Go ahead, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'm trying to figure out how to walk through this. There's 3 separate pots of money potentially. I guess I'll approach it from my non-appropriations sense, and maybe that'll help. So there's the state pot of money in section 2. That's what I was just talking about. And that money goes into a state fund. And if you make your claim to the board and the board decides it was a state order that provided a restriction that impacted your business, any relief that you're entitled to that the board grants you would come from that state fund. If the board is looking at a county order, there's a county fund that each county that issued an order has to establish under section 5. And they do the same process. The county fund folks have to look at the monies they received from coronavirus relief from the federal government and set aside 25% for this. So again, the county is using the same mechanism that the state is using, but they're using a different pot of money. And they're creating sort of 3 different pots of money. There's a state pot, a county pot, and a city pot, which obviously would be larger than smaller. And then depending on which order impacted your business, that's the pot of money the board would tell you to get your relief from. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Senator Thompson.
One quick question. We're talking about 25% of already unencumbered funds. I believe we had this discussion during the regular session. I just wanted to make sure I'm recalling it correctly. This 25% are from the coronavirus relief funds that are not already earmarked for something else.
That's correct in the amendment as written, correct, Mr. Thompson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Jason Thompson here. Yes, that's my understanding, is that the language on page 3 and 4 is written so that the director of the budget has to identify all of those federal monies, identify the transfers that are already required by law, and then determine a remaining 25% that's unencumbered to move to this fund.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Any other questions for the revisor? And just to bring everyone up to speed on the daily agenda, I noticed that the second page didn't get printed, so also on the daily agenda will be final action on bills previously heard. So we'll be looking to work this amendment today after we hear testimony. So to move us along, I'm going to ask, we have quite a few proponents and neutrals who are here to present oral testimony. I, over the break, had to give a legislative update in 5 minutes over the session, so I think 5 minutes would be enough for each of you to provide some testimony on the bill. And with that then, or excuse me, on the amendment to the bill. With that then, we will have our first proponent conferee, Eric Stafford with the Kansas Chamber of Commerce. And I'll let you know when there's about a minute remaining so that we can stay on track with our 5 minutes. Because we'll be going into caucus and session and things this afternoon, so we've got a busy schedule. Do we have Mr. Stafford here? If not, then we will move forward with Mr. Ryan Kriegshauser with Kriegshauser Nye Law Group. Mr. Kriegshauser, welcome back to committee.
Thank you very much. Ryan Kriegshauser, Kriegshauser Nye Law Group. I think Eric Stafford was here and he briefly got pulled out. I'll be very brief. I think you've heard me enough on this matter already. I testified on it a few times. I think this is a wonderful draft. I want to thank the committee for coming together with all the parties. And as the Attorney General alluded to, this is the product of litigation, and the Attorney General and the parties in that litigation agreed to stay that for the legislature to have an opportunity to address this. And as you know, the window to address it is closing rapidly. And so we've been open. We've had no pride of authorship in this. We've talked to a number of folks. We've talked to the counties, the cities, to try and reach some kind of consensus. And I think at the last hearing, there was a lot of movement when we started looking at ARPA funds and federal funds to bring this to the table. And I just think that this process adds an additional layer. This appointed board that just administratively operates under the Attorney General. It's not really directed by the Attorney General. It just, you know, in the military we have administrative control and operational control. And I think the idea here is that the Attorney General just is kind of where this is administratively held, but that the board acts autonomously based on the factors that the legislature has directed it to operate and give compensation. And I think that's wise, and I appreciate the committee working it and being open to this discussion and having a discussion with all the parties involved, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And committee, we will hold questions for the proponent conferees until they've all had an opportunity to present their testimony. And then I don't see Mr. Stafford back in the room yet, so we will then move to our next proponent conferee, Mr. Scott Schneider with the Kansas Restaurant and Hospitality Association. Welcome back to committee, and please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. I'm Scott Schneider with the Kansas Restaurant and Hospitality Association, and I too appreciate the work that's been done on this amendment and trying to create some clarity after this year that the future of many restaurants and the folks in the hospitality sector was really unclear. So a few things I do want to mention that as I heard the brief on the bill, the 50 or less full-time equivalent employees is a meaningful number. It's a meaningful approach to the different types of business or different types of restaurants, the size. Some restaurants are less sophisticated in their banking relationships, in their operations. Those who are larger tend to be ahead with their banking relationships and in first in line in the PPP process, and we anticipate they'll have an advantage. What this bill does is creates a safety net for those who don't. Not everybody's situated the same. Not everybody has the advantages. So we appreciate that approach. The other piece that perked my attention was essential, non-essential. In the governor's order, restaurants were declared essential, but then subsequently were severely restricted in what they could do. So having that as a single factor, not the factor, is important for this board as we move forward also. And then finally, the amount. I want to encourage you that a fifth of the entire state's economy is really run by the hospitality sector. I know these numbers seem large, but I just got an email from our national lobbying group, the National Restaurant Association, on the $28.6 billion fund. We expect that to be empty quickly. So as we move forward and we think of what harm has this done to these businesses, it's pretty extreme amount. So as the last dollar effort, I appreciate this being there for the people who haven't been able to get in front of some of these other programs. And with that, I'll stand for questions appropriate time.
Thank you, Mr. Schneider. We now have Mr. Eric Stafford is in the room. So Mr. Eric Stafford with the Kansas Chamber of Commerce, welcome back to committee, and please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Madam Chair and committee members. Good afternoon. Eric Stafford with the Kansas Chamber of Commerce. I'm sorry for being late, running around, and I've lost my notebook, so it's somewhere here in the Capitol. And I'm a bit flustered for running around trying to find my notebook, so I apologize. Appreciate the opportunity to speak in support of Senate Bill 286 again. Echo our comments from before with the case that has been around. I unfortunately missed the comments from the Attorney General, if you mentioned that, and what kind of started this discussion back in December with the case that was put on hold. Really, what we're looking for is helping those that are impacted, and I think as this issue has evolved over the last couple of months, trying to hammer out the concerns from local government, trying to really tighten up who would be eligible, who are we trying to target with some sort of relief for those who are impacted, I think is the biggest questions that we've been able to kind of go through and try to perfect what was started as a really good bill that had some issues. Just continuing to work with you all and leadership to find a solution for those businesses impacted. Again, I think it's important to mention that Scott just hit on that, you know, the governor and her executive order and emergency declaration had restaurants as an essential business, but then the restrictions that came in from the locals after. It's important to mention to this committee or for anybody listening online that our first meeting with the governor, first or second week of March, before she made any decision, I mean, the first words out of her mouth were, "I don't want to close businesses." I mean, she genuinely, truly did not want to close businesses. And there's been some criticism, you know, last fall and early in the session about that decision. But that was created with the input from the business community. Her orders were created with the input from the business community because of those restrictions that were being put in place on an ad hoc basis, on a county by county basis that varied greatly to the extent of some businesses being told you can't have more than a certain number of customers outside, and it's the job of your employees to manage a line of people spaced 6 feet apart outside of your facility if you exceed that capacity. And that's where the statewide order came in, but there were still some restrictions put in place on businesses and certain types of businesses, whether it's gyms or restaurants or bars, that lasted even until, ironically, right around the introduction of Senate Bill 286, when probably there was some concern that they might be facing some financial liability due to the duration of those restrictions. So overall, we're open to any type of structure that would put in place the oversight of this this fund and financial relief for those businesses impacted. But you know, just as long as there's a structure, I think is the biggest ask. So appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you all might have.
Thank you. Are there other proponent conferees in the committee meeting room? Are there any on WebEx? Seeing and hearing none then. Mr. Attorney General, would you like to make comment, or we'll just open it up for questions from the committee? We'll just open it up for committee member questions to any of our proponent conferees. Okay, seeing none then. We will then ask for neutral conferee testimony, and we then have first Jay Hall with the Kansas Association of Counties. Mr. Hall, welcome back to committee, and please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Jay Hall, for the Kansas Association of Counties. I appreciate my opportunity to speak before the committee here this afternoon now, I guess. Want to cover a couple of quick things. My comments were fairly general because I didn't have opportunity to review the full amendment prior to coming to the chamber or coming to the committee meeting today. But there are a couple of things that we still are concerned about within this bill. And the first is that this bill still does impose on local control. Local officials or county commissioners still would not have a role in this process. They would have no say in this process. It would go to the three-member board, but the county commissioners would not have a role. And that is a concern for our county commissioners. We are also concerned that it infringes on the ability of those local officials to put in place any sort of restrictions because of the fact that they may be concerned about potential financial liability of which they have no control over and what would happen with that. And then my final point would just be in reference to the American Rescue Plan funds, we are concerned that we have not yet received Treasury guidance. And so we don't want to potentially commit funds to this particular plan without knowledge that counties will be able to, under the Treasury guidance, commit those funds to this particular purpose. And so I just want to raise that to the committee that you're aware of, that we don't have that guidance yet. And so we are not saying that we are opposed to providing support to businesses, but we don't know exactly how we can provide that support as of yet. And so because of that, we don't want to commit to something that we may later have to back off of because we find out that the guidance does not allow for that. And with that, I would stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. We'll go ahead and hear from all the neutral conferees and then open it up for questions. We next have Ms. Amanda Stanley with the League of Kansas Municipalities. Welcome back to committee, and please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, for allowing me to come speak today. You heard from my colleague Amanda Stanley, League of Kansas Municipalities General Counsel. Last day, I'm almost getting this right. You heard from my colleague earlier in the session on this. I apologize for not being here myself. I was off at a funeral, but I listened to the dialogue. We really appreciate that the proponents took into account some of our concerns about the ambiguity on the language and fixed that. I, however, probably would not be doing my due diligence if I didn't at least raise one additional concern that I think that you guys should think about pretty broadly as a policy perspective. And that deals with, as I listened to the revisor going through the bill draft, the issue of transparency. And perhaps that's because as a lawyer, I have a healthy amount of skepticism about too much power being in the hands of any one particular person. But you will have a three-person board that is appointed that is making these decisions at the local level with no opportunity for appeal by the city or the county, with no ability to look at what those claims were. And that's no ability to appeal by the business either. So if the panel tells a business no, they don't get to appeal that either. They don't get to ask why, and all of these claims are confidential. And I know that's a policy choice. It's getting money out the door fast versus slowing it down because of having that ability to go back and forth in that due process. But I suppose as a taxpayer myself, I do always worry about that when we have money going out the door and there's no oversight. The state pot does have oversight from the State Finance Council, but those local pots do not have any kind of oversight. So as you debate this bill, I would just ask that you consider that. I understand it's a policy choice for you and there's no perfect bill. But with that, I'm happy to stand for questions at any given time.
Thank you. Then next we have Sarah LaFrenz with the American Federation of Teachers, Kansas. Welcome to committee, and please introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Thank you so much for your time today. In order to
go ahead and introduce yourself.
Oh, my name is Sarah LaFrenz. I'm the president of the American Federation for Teachers, Kansas. I'm also the president of the Kansas Organization of State Employees. So I appreciate the opportunity to provide neutral testimony with respect to Senate Bill 286. Provided that certain amendments are made to the bill, we would be able to strongly support this. A little bit about us. AFT Kansas is a federation of 14 public employee organizations, including KOS and the United Teachers of Wichita. And the federation represents workers on the front line of the pandemic response, including but most certainly not limited to correctional officers, healthcare workers like mental health technicians at Larned and Osawatomie State Hospitals, as well as teachers, snowplow drivers, KDOT workers. So Senate Bill 286 authorizes very, very important, yet to our eye, incomplete compensation for Kansans who have reckoned with the economic fallout of COVID-19. So you've heard a lot of the proponents talk about the effects of businesses of this pandemic. Absolutely. And we absolutely get that. We would like to also mention that frontline essential workers are no less deserving of this committee's gratitude and have no less earned the financial support of the committee that you're considering today. AFT Kansas would support Senate Bill 286, provided the bill were amended to include premium pay for essential workers as outlined in the Frontline Service Pay Act, which is Senate Bill 289. The program would provide a modest $3 per hour bonus to workers making under $25 per hour for the remainder of the pandemic to compensate essential workers carrying out their duties under these extraordinary conditions. I represent corrections officers who have been quarantined from their families for months, people that have COVID-19 syndrome, the ongoing effects of being infected with this particular virus. So these are things that we see consistently. It's extremely serious and it is very real. And I would ask for you all to keep that in mind as well. Because the program is administered as grants to employers who then can pass the pay to employees via their paychecks, this program can help prevent harmful labor shortages in essential businesses, which we're currently seeing now. Attracting new workers to these jobs is difficult, and some experts have warned of potential shortages as long as pay does not correspond with risk. And the Frontline Service Pay Act will help businesses recognize the hard work of their employees, improve workplace morale, and retain valued employees at no cost to the employers. This is based in part on promising models that have been enacted in 7 other states, including Pennsylvania, Louisiana, Michigan, and Virginia. And with authorization under the American Rescue Plan Act, ARPA, and models in other states, Kansas does not need to put itself out on a limb with untested ideas. We can improve Senate Bill 286 with policies proven to help workers and businesses both. A small bit of help will make a huge amount of difference to your constituents. Thank you very much for your consideration of this testimony, and I'm happy to answer questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you very much, Ms. LaFrenz. With that, then, I don't have any other neutral conferees on the agenda, but I will ask, are there any neutral conferees in the committee meeting room? Seeing none, do we have any neutral conferees on WebEx? Seeing and hearing none, then. On the agenda for today, we don't have any opponent conferees signed up, but I will ask, are there any opponent conferees in the committee meeting room? Seeing none, are there any opponent conferees on the WebEx? Seeing and hearing none, then. We will open it up for questions again for our neutral conferees. Do we have any committee member questions for our neutral conferees? Seeing one, so Senator Baumgartner.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. These are questions for Ms. LaFrenz.
Yes, Ms. LaFrenz, if you'll come up to the podium again. Thank you. And please introduce yourself when you're ready to answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Senator Baumgartner.
Thank you. Could you address, you represent quite a few different groups.
I do.
So which groups would fall under the receiving a bonus for earning $25 per hour or less?
So that would include, for the most part, most of your state employees that are correctional officers, non-supervisory employees, correctional officers, mental health technicians, so people working in Osawatomie and Larned, folks that work on the roads for KDOT. And then you also have, if you're under 25, like we have a service group in Wichita that works for Wichita State University, like in a mechanical group. There, a lot of them are under $25 per hour. So it's a great view and a very large sector of those workers.
So could you share with us approximately how many employees those are?
Well, for the workers that we represent, we have, for corrections officers, we have about 1,000 of them that we represent. And then, you know, throughout the state employees, like we have up to 6,000 to 7,000 that we represent across the board that are covered by our bargaining unit agreement.
Thank you very much. Madam Chair, my next question is for Mr. Hall.
Just a moment, please.
It's okay.
Committee, we have some good news. We have lunch provided, so we can have a working lunch if we will allow that to be passed out while we continue our work, if that's all right with everyone. And provided by Mr. Kevin Barone, so thank you. And with that then, Senator, I'm sorry, you had a question? Senator Baumgardner?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. My next question is for Mr. Hall.
Mr. Hall? Go ahead, Senator.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Mr. Hall, share with us how it is that the county commissioners want to be involved in this, because quite frankly, all that we have heard since the pandemic has started, we've heard it from city councils, we've heard it from school boards, and we've heard it from county commissions. Why are we having to make these decisions? So share with me all of these county commissioners that want to be a part of this decision-making.
Jay Hall for the Kansas Association of Counties General Counsel and Legislative Policy Director. Certainly, counties want to be involved, and I think that part of that work was done last summer in 2016 when it was demonstrated that we wanted to have local control. That's what counties have been asking for. We demonstrated that as well during last summer, or I guess last fall when we had the CARES Act money. Some of that money was distributed to businesses in the form of grants and things like that. And we'd like to have that same amount of ability to do that with the American Rescue Plan funds, provided that we are allowed to do so under the Treasury guidance. And so we're just waiting on that guidance so that we know how we can act before we commit to what we are going to do.
So what is your solution? I know you came to us with a complaint, so what is your solution?
My solution would be to allow the counties to go through the same process that they did for the CARES Act funding, provided, of course, that we follow the guidance that the federal government gives us for those funds. But that would be my first solution. Obviously, if you opt to use this particular method, then I would ask for an appeals process similar to what Ms. Stanley referenced in order for the county to have a role in that as well.
And do you acknowledge that as legislators and community members, we've heard lots of complaints about how funding was and wasn't dispersed at the county level?
I certainly understand that, yes.
So how would you address those issues?
I think that there is always going to be concerns from people. Obviously, you're going to have people that got less funding than they thought they should have gotten, people that maybe felt like they should have gotten funding, people that maybe missed the deadline or misunderstood how much funding that they were eligible for. And so there are always going to be people that will question the process. I just think that there should be a role for counties, and that obviously the process may not be perfect, but we'd like to be involved.
Okay, and you understand that counties had a role.
Yes.
And now we're at a different place.
Yes.
And we're looking at a different way to address what didn't occur at the county level.
Certainly, I understand that. There may be other people that complain about this particular process as well. So, of course, I can't see the future on that, but there may be other complaints that we can't envision right now.
So last question, Madam Chair. Could we count on the counties to provide a list of names of commissioners that would perhaps like to serve as one of those three positions?
We certainly can do that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Before we leave that issue, I would ask the reviser, does the bill, and where does it, if we have it written, that we would, in the bill, if it were to become law, look to obviously comply with Treasury guidance on how to commit these funds? Is it written that way already, that this will all be put together pursuant to that Treasury guidance?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Jason Thompson with the reviser. There is a provision in each of the fund sections. So it's new section 2, 5, and 6. It's very simple, but I'm told it has that effect. It's that the funds may be used in any manner consistent with state and federal law. And then there's also unless prohibited by federal law, monies in the fund shall be used for these purposes. So we've tried to allow for that possibility. This might not be approved, but assume that it will be. And if it is allowed, these would all be purposes the funds could be used for.
Correct, thank you. So that it's set up that the state is going to operate this Business Relief Act in accordance with that guidance from the Treasury Department and per law, per ARPA. Is that correct? Mr. Thompson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Jason Thompson again. Essentially, yes, if unless what you have in the bill is prohibited by federal law, the bill will operate as intended. If it is prohibited by federal law for some reason, then obviously that would trump the ability to use these funds in that way. So it will have to comply with federal law.
Right, of course. Okay, thank you. Committee members, other questions for any of our conferees? Senator Thompson.
I see Mr. Scott's in the room, and maybe he could answer this better than anyone. Where did the $100 million sum come up? Where is that from? Is it all federal dollars from the CARES Act? And is that sum, I think, raised by Mr. General, or maybe Mr. Schneider, going to be enough? If I understand this correctly, we are trying to compensate businesses for something that was beyond their control rather than looking for pay raises for people. This is for compensation. This is to try to, and probably not even close to make whole, people who were forced to close their businesses. And I want to know, why are we even looking at 25%? These are unencumbered funds. Why aren't we looking at 100% of these unencumbered funds? And I would invite anybody to answer those questions. Maybe I threw too many out there all at once. I'm sorry.
While the invitation is open, we're going to take a 2-minute break. If the committee members will stay at their seats, and we can we'll have lunch distributed here while we contemplate who's going to answer the question. Or perhaps it's easier if we go get our lunch. How about we do that? We'll take a 2-minute break. If we want to go grab a box and bring it back, and we will have a working lunch then.
I would, I would, if you're right.
Committee, thank you for, and those following online, thank you for the brief indulgence to grab some lunch while we get to work. We do have the proposal, a policy question from Senator Thompson regarding why not more than 25%. That's something that the committee would want to keep in mind, I guess, as an open question, unless we get that answered. And then before we have Mr. Attorney General depart the committee meeting room to attend to other state business, do we have any other questions for our Attorney General from the committee? I'm not seeing any, so thank you, sir, very much for attending today, and appreciate your time on this. Thank you. So committee, with that, any further questions? Would that be a question for Mr. Scott to answer, or it's kind of a policy decision? The 25% I don't think was based on anything concrete, but just kind of a starting point for the committee to consider. With that, then, do we have any other committee member questions for any of the conferees? I'm not seeing any then. So with that, yes, Senator Pyle.
Since there's no comment, I guess there would be no opposition to changing 25% to 100%. Is there comment on that, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. From any of the conferees, do we have any testimony on thoughts on changing the 25% of the funds allocated for the Business Relief Fund to 100%? Mr. Schneider, please introduce yourself. Go ahead.
Scott Schneider of the Kansas Restaurant and Hospitality Association. I do feel like I probably ought to say something on behalf of the proponents. Perspective, I think, is a good thing at this point. In the underlying 286, we put $100 million in there because we needed a discussion starting point. That was before the federal, we knew about the federal money. But for perspective, the month of April, we lost in the restaurant industry alone $325 million worth of sales. That continued. That was just within the restaurants. That's not the hospitality side of things. That's not the gyms. That's not the salons. That's not the targeted people that were shut down. So as you think about what 25% versus 50 versus 100%, that is a policy. But I do want you to know that the numbers in and of themselves are dramatic if you were to look at it on the loss side of things, on sales. So thank you.
And to Senator Thompson's point, it would be very difficult to compensate each of these businesses to 100% of what their loss has been. Could you speak to that for just a moment, Mr. Schneider?
It would probably be like trying to purchase a piece of the moon. It's a little hard to do just because the numbers are so dramatic in that. But at the same time, if you're looking for a comparable, we did the Hire Fund. The Department of Commerce put out the Hire Fund, $5 million. And I think they gave something like $20,000 to 300 businesses. Well, what about the rest? There's about 5,000 licensed food establishments in the state that didn't get the $20,000, and which was later forgiven. So for perspective, there is a substantial need out there if you're going to look at the loss side of it. You know, we think there was a taking. What was the harm? The harm is pretty substantial. But the way the bill's written, it's not the first dollar in type of bill. It's the last dollar out type of bill. You know, the weight is, did you avail yourself of the Hire Fund, the PPP fund? What other program was out there that you got to partake in? Not everybody benefited out of the PPP, for example. Some of the larger restaurants, some of the more sophisticated operators did, and it quite honestly saved them. Some of the smaller folks who had nobody to bring back to work didn't have any real benefit out of that program, so they didn't see why they should take it. So this may fill a gap that needs to be filled. So thank you.
I have one other question, Mr. Schneider, and probably for the chamber as well. the number 50, that's kind of captures a lot of restaurants across Kansas that would fall within that category of 50 employees, as well as a lot of small businesses across Kansas. Is that kind of the average number of restaurant employees? I think it's 23, 24 for the average restaurant in the state.
We looked at this earlier in the linked deposit loan program, I think, as we tried to, like, what's the number that program would fit? And I think we came up with 200 as the, because that's a loan that you're going to pay back. The 50 full-time equivalent is important because a lot of the restaurants, it's not somebody's first job, it's their second job, it's their third job, it's the high schoolers, it's other folks that they're coming in there and maybe they don't work full-time. So understanding what that FTE actually is an important distinction of why 50 makes more sense than some other number.
Thank you. Committee, other questions for any of the conferees? Senator Baumgartner.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't think that we've heard any other response to the presentation, what we had heard with regard to state employees, and I was just wondering if any others had a comment with regard to that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Do we have any other conferees who, we heard some testimony regarding Senate Bill 289 and state employees. Senate Bill 289, while we were here, I looked at, and it is in Senate Ways and Means Committee, and it hasn't had a hearing, so it's not in this committee. But any other thoughts on, I guess, the purpose of the Business Relief Act here that we have is it's business, not government entities. So that's the purpose of this act, which isn't necessarily the purpose of 289 is kind of the difference. But any comments from conferees would be good, or Senator Baumgartner?
Excuse me, Madam Chair, I understand that, and certainly the groups that were addressed exceed the 50 employees. Just didn't know if we had any other further information on that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Sure. Any conferee available to provide any other information? Or yes, Mr. Kriegshauser, please introduce yourself.
Ryan Kriegshauser, Kriegshauser Nye Law Group. I mean, the one thing I would say is the impetus behind this bill is to solve litigation risk. We have a case currently on file under current law, under KSA 48933. We have a claim, we believe a valid one, that a court will adjudicate. And the point of the bill is that there may be thousands of other businesses with the exact same claim that could file a lawsuit today. And this bill is really designed to deal with that litigation risk. And so it's a much different thing than just giving relief. The impetus of the bill is to solve the current litigation, both the ongoing litigation and the potential litigation. So I think the impetus behind this bill is a little different, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Yes, Senator Gossage.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is, I'm thinking of restaurant franchisees. And yes, we have independent restaurants, but we have McDonald's and many others that were closed down. Curious if each franchisee would be considered fewer than 50 FTE, because of course, if you take McDonald's as a whole, it'd be many more than that.
Do we have a conferee who can address that question? Mr. Schneider.
Scott Schneider again with the Kansas Restaurant and Hospitality Association. It's a fair question because every business model is unique and not everybody fit into the same bucket in this program versus the next one. As a franchisee, just the answer would be, it depends on how they're organized. Do they have 50 or do they have 50 FTE? Quite honestly, most of the bigger restaurant chains are going to have more than 50, but at the same time, they're more sophisticated. They've likely already availed themselves of substantial PPP programs and have figured out how to find some capital in different types of ways. And then if they don't fit under this, they will also be able to pursue litigation. So that's the trade-off. If they still wanted relief and didn't fit under this settlement arrangement, they would still be able to avail themselves of a claim. So that's the policy decision that you're struggling or dealing with here today.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. What I'm hearing then is that they are not excluded from this, but would have to fit in with all the parameters. And if they did, then they could find relief.
Correct.
Thank you.
Mr. Schneider, while you're there, we heard concerns about transparency, that it's a 3-person panel and there's no appeal process. Could you speak to that? I mean, the intent of the act would be to provide less burden for businesses who have already been so burdened for the last year and more, some relief. And if you could speak to the concerns that were brought up.
I appreciate the idea that everybody should have some measure of due process. It does ring hollow to me as worked through the last year when we couldn't find any due process from the restaurant perspective with our local governments. We had multiple counties call a meeting the day of the meeting, pass a rule that went into effect that night. How do you conduct business when that's happening? So yes, I wish things had more due process, but I wish we had more due process too. During the KEMA debate, I encouraged the entire legislature to come back anytime you're going to do something as significant as shut down businesses. But the solution was to expand the LCC and deal with it that way, which may be more practical. But I was trying to also make a point. So is it the worst thing ever? No. We need to get the money that's available out to these businesses as fast as possible, and this is one way to do it. Is it the only way? Probably not. But I think this is a meaningful way to do it.
Thank you. Mr. Kriegshauser, you had a comment as well?
Thank you, Chair. Ryan Kriegshauser, Kriegshauser and I Law Group. The one thing I would add is that on page 7, in that provision, the confidentiality provision, subsection C includes federal or state agencies when necessary in the performance of their official duties or functions. And when you think about that, that's a pretty broad exclusion that would allow for audit potential. I mean, this provision, I think, would arguably allow post-audit to come in and look at that information, as well as any federal auditing agency can look at the use of those funds. And it's even broad enough, I mean, any state agency in the performance of their official duties. I mean, that's pretty broad. So I wouldn't say it's as tightly confidential as the first language. I mean, this is actually quite a bit broader to allow for audit potential. That's all.
Thank you. Yes, Senator Pyle.
I'm going to redirect a little bit here. I'm looking at the fund that's created, and maybe I missed it, but does anybody?
Would you make sure you speak onto your microphone?
Okay, sorry, Madam
There we go. Thank you.
I'm curious as to whether or not we have any kind of a dollar figure how large this fund is.
Thank you. Do we have that information? I think it's, well, I could guess, but I don't want to hazard a guess. Do we have that information anywhere? Mr. Revisor, do we know what we're looking at? I think it's around, well, I'm not going to hazard a guess.
Madam Chair, this is Jason Thompson with Revisor. I'll defer to the Research Department and the fiscal staff. I think they have maybe a ballpark idea, I hope.
Yeah, Ms. Nelson, if you could provide that.
Hello, this is Natalie Nelson from Legislative Research. I don't have that figure since I'm not a fiscal, but I can get that information from a fiscal. I think they might be in Ways and Means right now, but I will see if I can find anyone that would have that information.
Thank you. That'd be helpful. I heard some numbers, but I don't want to throw them around. Mr. Scott, are you available to help us out here? Please go ahead and introduce yourself.
My name is J.G. Scott with Legislative Research. The fund, the Coronavirus Relief Fund, was originally appropriated or transferred about $1.2 billion. Most all of that has been allocated already. There are some funds that are still available. So most of that, like I said, has been, there was about 400 million that was allocated to the counties, which you had referenced earlier. But I believe then we can get you the exact amount that's left unencumbered, but we can get you that information.
You don't know that right now.
No, but I think we updated some stuff last week.
So the money that I'm understanding is the unencumbered fund, then 25% of that's what's going to be available for relief. Is that correct or wrong?
That's my understanding of what the bill says.
Right, that's correct, Mr. Thompson, right? 25% of what's left after ARPA money has been, what's left after what's already been appropriated of ARPA money. Is that correct, Mr. Thompson or JG, Mr. Scott?
The fund that I was talking about was the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which was part of the CARES Act. If we're looking at the ARPA fund, then the federal government will be distributing 1.6 million or billion to the state. And that has not been transferred yet. And it has not been allocated. I don't believe any state has really allocated any funding yet. They're still waiting for guidance from Treasury on what items those can be expended on.
Thank you.
So, Madam Chair, follow up. So then we don't know how big this is. We don't know how much money we're talking about.
If it's referencing the Coronavirus Relief Fund, that was that original $1.2 billion that was allocated, of which we're not sure how much has been allocated to different purposes yet, but we can get that information.
But there will be more money based on the Rescue Act that'll be coming that we could add to that pot, right?
If you so chose to do so, yes, there's a substantial, I think, 1.6 billion coming into the state for expenditures.
Mr. Thompson, could you answer Senator Pyle's question that the funding primarily for the Business Relief Act, the COVID-19 Business Relief Act that we're talking about, primarily will come from the Rescue Act, the ARPA that's going to be to the state. Is that right, Mr. Thompson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Jason Thompson here. And I can tell you what's in the bill, which unfortunately is the piece that was given to me by our appropriations folks. So the extent of what I can tell you is what it says on page 4. And that is, we're looking at unencumbered funds from the CARES Act, from the Federal Coronavirus Preparedness and Response Supplemental Appropriation Act, on down the list. And then there's the American Rescue Plan Act, which is ARPA. And then there's any other federal law that appropriates money to the state for aid for coronavirus relief. So I think it's drafted in a way to say all of the coronavirus relief money, ARPA and et cetera, and to certify an amount that is 25% of what is unencumbered. That's the way it's drafted right now.
Go ahead, Senator Pyle.
And I thank you for that. It'd be nice to have our hands around what the total amount's going to be, and then realize too that only 25% of that is what we're obligating for relief, which begs the question, where's the other 75? And my understanding of the bill is it leaves it up to whoever to go ahead and spend that as long as there's no prohibitions on it. Is that correct?
Mr. Thompson, are you able to answer that?
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is Jason Thompson again. My understanding is that any funding not accounted for in this bill is accounted for under other appropriation acts of the legislature. So if you have provisions saying those federal monies are to be spent for a particular purpose or to be administered by a certain entity or to be overseen by the State Finance Council, for example, all of that would still apply. This is only to address setting aside a 25% pot to be administered by this board. Everything else would be as provided by law, state or federal.
So, Madam Chair, I have a question then for the proponents, those that are neutral or else. Does anyone in this room, do you believe 25% of that fund is going to take care of the relief, the request? I'd just like to know.
Do we have any proponents, neutrals in the room, any conferees who want to address that or have any thoughts on that? Mr. Schneider.
Scott Schneider with the Kansas Restaurant and Hospitality Association. It will address it more than doing nothing. And I know that's not the answer that you want to hear, but if you do nothing, then the only remedy we have is to pursue each claim in court. Doing something is better than nothing, we think. It creates some efficiencies, it creates some certainties, both for the governments involved, but us also. So what's the right number? If we were here in June or July, we might know. But right now, anything is better than doing nothing.
Thank you, Scott. Madam Chair, can I follow up?
Yes, go
Now,
ahead,
let's
Senator.
just sort of think with me for a minute. We got to balance the bag of money. We got a big pot. We got 25% money over here, and we got the other 75% over here. We run out of money for relief for businesses because we only put 25% obligated. And yet we leave 75% of that pot left for appropriations to deal with. This is our opportunity to say, no, we're going to give the relief to the businesses, the ones that were hit the hardest, those that were closed, those who are seeking relief. Why can't we make that pot bigger and this one smaller? And then if we have excess revenue setting in that pot, come back and reappropriate that money. Is not that doable?
That'd be a policy question,
I
Senator.
understand
Yeah.
that. I'm asking if that's.
Yes,
that
go
they
ahead,
would-
From
Mr.
my
Schneider.
perspective, it is doable. And the analogy that we have that's already happened is the Hires Fund. We had 300 and some businesses get $20,000 in a day. What do we do to the rest of them? You had to wait. If you were to take that and give the preference to the business, and then secondarily, if there's money left over, the government gets it after the fact. That would be a new approach in Topeka. While I'm not in your position to make the policy, I think it should be considered.
That answer.
Yes, Mr. Hall.
Yes, Jay Hall, Kansas Association of Counties. I was doing some looking to see if I could find the numbers for the county portion at least. And it looks like Kansas should receive about $620 million for counties. That should be separate from the state fund, the state portion as well as the city portion. I would also note that if you were to allocate more money for the business relief and that money were not spent, because of the way the bill is written, the time to spend that money would run out and that money would go back to the federal government. It would not go to anyone in Kansas, whether that be businesses or other entities. It would simply go back to the federal government because the time frame to spend that money would run out. And so if you allocate more funds here at the onset, those funds would be encumbered and the state, the cities, the counties would not be able to access those funds until the end of the claim period, which would also coincide with the end of the period to spend those funds federally before that money must be returned to the federal government if it's not encumbered. But that would be a policy question as well.
Thank you, Senator Pyle.
Yes, follow up on that. So you are basically saying that if we put more money in the pot and that money is not applied for and allocated, then it would go back to the federal government?
That's correct.
Okay. Do you really believe there's not that we can't deal with this knowing the deadline by 24?
Well, the way the bill is written currently, it says that if it gives businesses until a certain date to apply for those funds. You would need to change those dates in order to make sure. But as the bill is currently written, which is what I'm basing this off of, as it's currently written, the timeframes would run simultaneously, which would mean that money would go back to the federal government.
Is there, and I know this is not a question for you, but maybe for Jason Thompson. Jason, could that time date of 24 be moved out?
Mr.
Or
Thompson?
is that something federals are requiring us?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Jason Thompson again, and not to, I'll say, yes, there's a policy choice here, but I will correct, I think, a slight misunderstanding here that the way the bill is structured is that there's a claim window and the board has to make its decision on all those claims by the end of 2022. The federal funds have to go back by the end of 2024, is my understanding. So the bill is written so that beginning on January 1 of 2023, any remaining funds in this business relief fund can be used for any other purpose for that final year that's available, or even 2 years that's available. So we've tried to provide in the draft that the money goes to the businesses, and if there is any left for any reason, it could still be expended before it had to be returned to the federal government. So I believe we've accomplished that. My appropriations folks tell me that language in section 2, 5, and 6 would do that. So if there's anything else we need to do, I'm happy to look at that, but I think we've done that.
And I may have misunderstood the dates that were in the bill. I was kind of speed reading this as we were going through it this afternoon, but I thought that was the case, but that Jason may in fact be right, that those dates do allow for time. And if that was the case, then we would be able to allocate more without the risk of the funds going back. I just wanted to make sure that we weren't putting the counties and the state and the cities in a position where those funds would just be held and then go back without any action being taken here.
Right, returning it to the.
And Jason, just to follow up, I have a question. Could the counties and municipalities actually, to empty out that fund, could they give that for property tax relief to use up the funds?
I don't believe we can use it to lower taxes.
Well, that's what some of the rules are now,
waiting
but
on-
we're creating a new fund for new purposes. Could that money that's left over be used that way?
I think it would have to be in accordance with, the guidelines that we get regarding the use of the money. As long as it was compliant with that, I would think. Correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Thompson.
Madam Chair, Jason Thompson again. No, you're absolutely right. It just says, beginning on that January 1 of 23, remaining monies may be used in any manner consistent with state and federal law. So if it's allowed by the guidelines and allowed by law, it can be used for that purpose. It's restricted up until that point, but then it opens back up.
Yes, Senator Thompson. Thank you, Mr. Hall.
And maybe it's for JG, I'm not sure. Just want a clarification. Is that $100 million pot the 25% we're talking about, or is that the 100% and we're just taking 25% of that? I guess I got confused in this whole process of.
That would be a question, I think, for Mr. Thompson. As the bill is written, It would be, well, you can explain it's 25% of what, if you could.
Sure. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll take one more shot at it.
And I don't mean of what dollar amount, but of what description of where it's 25% of what fund?
Right. So thanks again, Madam Chair. Jason Thompson with the revisor. So what the bill contemplates is that all of the federal monies to the state for aid for coronavirus relief would be looked at in whole. So from ARPA, from anything left from the CARES Act, from anything that comes in before July 15th of 2021. I mean, essentially all of the money given to the state from the federal government identified on page 4 there. And we have some general numbers that are floating around, and I'm deferring to the folks who know the numbers to do that, but it's a substantial number, and 25% of that is also a substantial number. I just don't want to give those numbers because it's just not my role here, but that's the pot we're talking about.
Okay, so the $100 million really is just a figment of our head. It's probably bigger than that, correct?
Well, I think it's 1.6 billion that's coming to the state from ARPA. It's 1.6 billion.
Right.
And then some of that will go to the state and some of that will go to the counties. All of it goes to the state. Okay, so 1.6 billion coming to the state, and some of it has already been appropriated through other legislation that we've worked on this session. And then it would be 25% of the remainder.
It's unencumbered.
It's unencumbered.
Gotcha.
Right.
Okay, just want to make sure I was completely clear on that. So there was a $100 million number
Earlier, right.
earlier. Yeah. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Baumgartner.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just want to make sure, are we certain that that 1.6 billion of ARPA will be here by the July 15th?
That's a valid question. That would be for, I'm not sure who that question is for. Mr. Thompson?
Madam Chair, I'll just chime in real quick. I apologize for the confusion here. This is Jason Thompson with the revisor. I only mentioned the July 15th date because there's actually a provision that says if we receive money after July 15th, the director of the budget still has to kind of identify that as well. So that's a little bit of a moving target. I didn't want to mislead you there. There will be a certification that happens, before that and after that. And essentially, I think it will happen all the way up until, the board is making its decisions, right? Here's all of the federal money we've received and we've set aside all of this, and here are the number of claims that have been presented, and here are all the claims that are paid out. And then that's when we close it out. I think that's sort of how it's set up. So the July 15th date is in the bill as a reference point, because that's one of the times when we do this. But it's not the final time that the director of the budget would do that.
So we're okay if they don't all come in by July 15th, 2021, we can still work with that for this fund. Is that correct? Yeah. I thank you, Mr. Thompson. Other questions? Not seeing any. I have just one follow-up for Mr. Kriegshauser regarding, there was some testimony regarding that there wouldn't be an appeal process and things like that for businesses who opt to go through this claims process. And the idea is, again, to get businesses who have been harmed for some time, to get them some immediate relief and immediate help. Is that a concern to you that, or you're a proponent of the bill, so I'm assuming you're okay with that process as well?
Yes, Ryan Kriegshauser, Kriegshauser and I Law Group. This is something, yes, the point is to get the relief as quickly as possible out to the people who need it. And I believe Senator Corson and I discussed just philosophically some of these ideas about when the ability to pursue a chemo claim under 4890-33 goes away versus going through this process. And all of that is structured to make this process as expedited as possible. And so that really is why it is written the way that it is.
And it's written the way you would have to then choose your remedy, right? Either go through this claims process or pursue something in 933.
Correct.
Thank you. Any other questions for any of our conferees? Seeing none, then I want to thank everyone who has come to committee today on this very important issue. And I think we had a big, broad, diverse view of a lot of stakeholders from all different angles. And I think that's important when we're crafting something like this. So appreciate that, and appreciate all the work through session that we've been working on. So with that, then, we will close the hearing on SB 286, and we are ready to work it. However, just want to make sure that we're not back on the floor right now, and we're in caucus right now, but I think we need to keep working on this. This is something that Kansans across the state have been asking for. So with that, then, we will open it up to working Senate Bill 286. Yes, Senator Corson.
Madam Chair, with your indulgence, I would like to make an amendment to move the text of Senate Bill 289 into this bill. Obviously, I don't have the written amendment to distribute, so I would leave it to your indulgence, but I would like to ask to move the contents of Senate Bill 289 into this bill. And just to talk a little bit about it, I mean, this is really hazard pay for all essential workers. I think there was maybe a misconception that this was just state employees, but this would be all essential workers, providing compensation to them and really giving businesses a tool to help retain those workers. And so I would like to make that with your indulgence, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Revisor, is that... well, that's a proper motion at this time?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Jason Thompson here. Yeah, it's a motion to amend, and you can proceed as you wish.
Okay, and I want to make sure that I haven't moved that we amend 286 with the, I guess, 21 RS 2220. I guess I'd make that motion before we entertain Senator Corson's motion, if that is in order. Is that in order at this time, Mr. Thompson?
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Well, we don't have a second for the motion yet, so yes, we have a second for the motion. Okay, well, any discussion on the motion? Yes, Senator Pyle.
I'd just like to know, is that bill in the same section of statute as this one, Mr. Thompson? The amendment bill 289.
We're looking at the amendment.
Are you talking about the Senator Corson amendment? That's what I said.
Right, to add Senate Bill 289 to 21 RS 2220, the amendment that we're talking about today. So to add it into this. It looks to me like if there's no, I'm looking at 289 right now. I know we have the revisor here, but it's a new act. It's not amending any, well, it does amend one part, and it's not a part that's mentioned in the amendment we were hearing today. Is that correct, Mr. Revisor?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, you have, what you're discussing is a new act with one amendment to the Emergency Management Act, and 289, which I'm not very familiar with, but I'm looking at right now, is a new act that has one amendment in a tax section. It looks like relating to an exemption from state income tax for something that's provided in the new act. But if you're asking generally for, we don't opine on germaneness, if that's the question you're getting to, but I will say single subject wise, it's all about the emergency, the COVID-19 emergency, and I think we could make it work as a constitutional single subject if you need it to. But beyond that, I'll leave it to the committee to determine, further questions of germaneness or relevance or whether they fit together as a policy matter. That's not really my position.
Senator Wilborn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am not trying to squelch this motion at all, but I'm very unfamiliar with that 289. I think you've caught us in a situation where we're boxed in with time, and I think we really need to know what's in that bill.
I agree with those sentiments. Thank you, Senator Wilborn. Senate Bill 289, like I said earlier, is not in this committee. It's a Ways and Means committee. It's a tax bill. Senate Bill 286, which we're looking at in this committee, is not a tax bill. So it doesn't seem particularly germane to me. If we have a question of germaneness, I'd be happy to rule on that. If not, we can just go ahead and vote on the motion. Seeing none then, you've heard the motion to amend, I guess, let me make sure I have this right, Mr. Revisor, to amend 21 RS 2220 by adding in the contents of Senate Bill 289.
Madam Chair, Jason Thompson again. I understood the motion just to be to amend 289 into 286, and then if you wanted to do further amending, we could bundle them all together at some point. But in either case, the motion is to add the contents of 289 to 286, and that's the motion before you.
Committee, you've heard the motion. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed, no. The motion fails. We're back on the bill, 286. So with that, then I will make a motion to insert the contents of 21 RS 2220 into Senate Bill 286. Is there a second? Senator Wilborn. Committee discussion. Yes, Senator Gossage.
I think we've had some good discussion about raising that amount from the 25%, and I was wondering if that would be best done at this point before putting this amendment into the bill.
I would say let's go ahead and
First.
We'll adopt the motion or not, and then we can continue to work what that looks like. And I will entertain some oral motions if they're not too complicated for the revisor and us and the public to follow. So if I'm correct, then we're ready for a vote unless we have further discussion on the motion. No, we don't. So with that, then you all have heard the motion to, Mr. Revisor, is it to substitute the contents of Senate Bill 286 with 21 RS 2220?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Jason Thompson. Yes, I would say you're replacing the current contents with the contents of 21 RS 2220. That's right.
Okay, committee, you have heard the motion. All those in favor, aye. All those opposed, no. The motion carries. So then we are back on the bill and entertaining if we have a motion regarding changing the 25%. Do we have a motion?
I move that we change the 25% number in what would now be, do we call this 21 RS, or do we call it?
Mr. Revisor, is it SB 286? Or is it the sub for SB 286, or what's your preference, Mr. Revisor?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Jason Thompson again. Now that you've replaced the contents, I think it will be substitute for Senate Bill 286. At this point, you can continue calling it 286 for your motions, but you're amending the amended contents. So it's probably easier to just call it substitute for 286 now. That's going to be clear for everybody.
Go ahead, Senator Gossett.
Clarification. I move that we change the 25% to 100% in the substitute for Senate Bill number 286.
Mr. Thompson, yes, Mr. Thompson, before we have a second, are you clear on what the proposed motion is?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, I believe so. I think you're just changing the percentage in the fund in section 2, 5, and 6.
And that's on pages 3 and 4.
Madam Chair, the 25% is on page 4 for section 2, and then there'd be comparable provisions later on in the county and city funds.
Do we have a second? Senator Thompson, thank you. Discussion on the motion. Committee, 100%, 100%. Are we? We're making a big change from 25% to 100%. Yes, Senator Wilborn.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I fully understand the spirit in which this increase was requested. However, 100% is pretty rich. I would like to find, I think, from my point of view, something in between the 25 and the 100% to give us some leeway down the road. By taking the 100%, that pretty well limits us on the top end. That's my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Pyle.
I like the 100%, but I do know the process, and I know that it's going to get pared down. I understand that. It's a good starting point, 100%. The question is, we aren't limiting anybody. This money is going to get spent. The question before us on a policy is, how big are we going to make the purse for business relief? Are we going to pare this down and limit it? Or are we going to make sure that we cover all of the businesses out there? Or are we going to force entities to pick and choose who the winners and losers are on whether they get relief or not? So we need to make it big enough that it covers everybody, at the same time realizing the money will eventually get used. The question is where's it going to go in the process? Is it going to end up at 50? If it is, then we need to start higher. If we start at 50, we're going to go down to 35. So I'm not going to be opposing this motion. If the motion maker wants to make it at 75, I would support that also. I think that would be a fair compromise. But I do know that I believe in the process it's going to get changed. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Wilborn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I understand and agree with Senator Pyle that from a negotiating point of view, we are starting high enough to have some leeway to work, and I agree. I think at the end of the day, 100 is a little stout, but maybe we need to go there to start off. I can go along with that.
Senator Thompson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I seconded this motion because these are unencumbered funds. this is a slush fund, basically, and people will be looking at this for an opportunity to take whatever's left over. Yet, through governors and entities' orders, we shut these businesses down. They had no choice in the matter, and I understand this is rich, but I think there should be a punitive nature to this so that in the future, people will look to this situation and say, wait a minute, we've got to be very judicious about how we shut down businesses and the economy of this state. We've lost, Johnson County alone, we've lost 25% of the small businesses in that county, many who were not able to take advantage of the PPP funds. So I understand the point about not going all the way, but I also think that there are consequences to shutting down businesses. There are consequences to shutting down an economy, and this is only a very small part of compensating those businesses who either lost their business completely or lost millions and millions of jobs and dollars in profit. That had they stayed open, we could have gotten sales tax back. There needs to be some punitive nature to this, whether or not it's built into the bill, and so I will support the amendment.
Thank you. Senator Gossage.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My first question was regarding this 25% because that was my concern, that we wouldn't have enough funds. They would have to pick winners and losers, as Senator Pyle had said. And I also understand that this could be negotiated down and that the funds that were not used could go back into a fund for another purpose. That was my thinking in creating this motion.
Is Senator Corson?
I'm going to be opposing the motion, although I obviously respect the maker of the motion and the reasoning behind it. I just think 100%, we have a lot of various competing priorities as a state. And I think to say 100% of it should be going all to businesses, to me, I just don't think that we want to obligate every single last penny to this one purpose. And frankly, one of the things I think I would keep in mind is that, if anybody should be, quote, coming in high, it should be the proponents. And I'm assuming that they, coming in at 25%, they felt like that was an appropriate amount. I mean, nobody twisted their arm to get to 25%. They are very smart, very capable advocates. They decided that 25% would be their mark, and if anybody should be coming in high, I think it should be a proponent of the bill, and I respect proponents for coming in high. So for us to quadruple what even the proponents are doing, I just don't think is fiscally responsible for our state, given that we have a lot of different needs as a state. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Baumgartner.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, I don't think that was the position of proponents. I think if their position was that it needed to be 100%, that they would have been opponents. I think that the reason we only have a few businesses that have filed lawsuits is because, look at it, businesses that were harmed, family businesses, small businesses, the makeup of our communities, they have to pony up to hire the attorney to take on the state, to take on the county, to take on whomever. Throughout our state, we have folks that have suffered tremendously. It's part of the reason we passed the Promise Act, because we know folks are going to need new education for jobs that are no longer available. They need to be retrained because their jobs are gone. The company that they worked for, the business that they work for is gone. This is a part of what happens. They come to the state for remedy. They come to the state for remedy because the action was taken on them by the state. When the governor issues executive order after executive order, where there is not input regionally or locally, we heard last spring and last summer from the Restaurant Association, they were willing and ready to come up with guidelines to self-police. They know their business inside and out. They were excluded. They were never brought to the table to come up with how to safely stay open. And so these businesses, and let's keep in mind, these are Kansans. These Kansans deserve some remedy. So I will be supporting this amendment. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Gossage.
Just a quick question, making sure I understand correctly. By saying 100%, we're saying 100% is available. Doesn't mean all 100% must be used, correct?
What's remaining after the coronavirus funds that haven't already been appropriated would be appropriated at whatever percentage that's in the bill, whether it's 100, 25, 75, would be appropriated for this fund.
And let's say
I have that right, Mr. Revisor, yes?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Jason Thompson with the Revisor. Yes, it's a percentage of unencumbered or remaining monies available in those funds. And if the question is whether the board has to allocate all of that money, the answer is no. There is no provision requiring them to exhaust the fund. It just requires them to evaluate how much money is there, how much relief should be given based on each claim, but there's no set amount or a requirement to expend all of the money, if that's the question.
And then one last question, if I may, just to clarify. So let's say we say 100%, maybe it's pared down later, but let's say we say 100% is available, Jason or Mr. Thompson, and then they find that, we really don't need all these funds. Thanks for making them available to us. We have, I'm making this up, 25% left over. What did we say happens to that 25%?
Go ahead, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Jason Thompson again. The provisions in the bill just say that for the time period until the end of 2022, the money can only be used for the claims made under the Act and some other related purposes. And then January 1 of 2023, the funds in that fund could be used for any purpose allowed by state and federal law.
That's my understanding. Okay, thank you so much.
I think the bill kind of contemplates the funds will be used for the businesses, so it wouldn't be a lot left over otherwise, because we have a lot of claims. And just to be clear, the bill is not just for those businesses who were closed. It includes restaurants who had to operate at 50% capacity in their restaurants, those who had to enforce, the social, all that sorts of things. So it's not just for only the businesses that were closed entirely. So with that, further discussion on the motion. Seeing none, then the motion is to amend the substitute 286 by changing the 25% to 100% as it's every time it's stated in the substitute bill. So with that, committee, we will have a vote then. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed, no. The motion carries. We're back then on the bill. Yes. And we have a second over here, Senator Baumgartner. Committee then, the motion is to pass out, any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, then you've heard the motion. All those in favor, aye. All those opposed, no. The motion carries. Committee then, we have concluded our work for today and probably for this session. We will see though. Yes, Senator Baumgartner.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Knowing where this is going next onto the floor, we really do need to have information with regard to all of those different funds and what of those funds have not been encumbered. We really do need to have that outlined. And with the new funds that are coming in, that we anticipate at some point, the 1.6 billion, we need to have earmarked which of those are encumbered with regard to other pieces of legislation. Thank you, Madam.
Thank you, Senator. I agree, and we'll be asking Ms. Nelson and Mr. Scott to help put that information together. This will probably likely come to the floor tomorrow, and so we'll be needing to get that information gathered right away or late tonight. So we have our tasks in front of us. Thank you again, committee. Thank you for following online. Thank you for everyone who joined us. We are adjourned.